Welcome back to another episode of The Download with Joe. It feels good to be back. And as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Joe Amador. It's a pretty exciting episode today, a panel style episode, which is something that we haven't done before. So hopefully everything tunes out okay. I'll shortly open the floor to my guests and our guests to introduce themselves, but just for some context, we wanted to bring these individuals on because they provide different perspectives on the built environment. And for this episode, we want to focus on how buildings are no longer just energy consumers and they're becoming a more active player in the grids. And each company comes in from a different angle. And we can walk through how different building owners can unlock revenue, resilience, and just overall value by turning their properties into more assets across the grid. So thanks everyone for joining. Courtney, would you like to introduce yourself and give us a 30-second snapshot of your background?
Sure. My name is Courtney Blodgett, and I am the co-founder of EDO, which is a commercial building virtual power plant solution provider, which we'll get into. My background is I've spent more than 20 years doing innovation and clean tech. So I came more from the renewable side of things, and then worked on mini grids, and then started doing impact investing. So doing VC investing in impactful companies, and then eventually made my way to one of EDO's parent companies, McKinstry, where I helped to spin EDO out of McKinstry and Avista, our other parent company. Great to be here.
Great stuff. Brendan, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. So my name is Brendan Reed. I am a vice president of growth at a company called Sparkfund. Sparkfund is a utility services company that helps utilities scale distributed energy resources across their system using a variety of different technology types. My background is in clean energy project development as well as energy policy and regulatory work. Been here about 8 years. And have kind of worn a variety of commercial and business development hats. So look forward to joining the conversation today.
Last but not least, Thomas.
Thanks, Lewis. Hi, everybody. My name is Thomas Armstrong. I'm the Director of Partnerships here at Voltus. Voltus is a demand response or VPP operator. And so we take the load flexibility that Courtney and Brendan are really helping buildings generate, and we go monetize that in the energy market. So we'll talk about a lot of that today of how the markets work and some of the pitfalls and opportunities. But our job is really to connect those assets to the market and help these customers get bill savings and new revenue streams. I've been with Voltus for a couple of years, working primarily in the building control space and also in the battery development space. Before this, I worked in the EV charging industry, and I spent the beginning of my career working for utilities. So I know the pain of transmission and distribution grids a little too well in the United States, a little bit in the UK, Lewis. And so I'm happy to talk about all that today. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great. It's good to have all of you. And I guess a way to frame this for our audience, buildings, Lewis noted in the intro, they're not just a user of energy, but they're also a grid asset. So maybe around the horn, we can just get a quick take on how does a building make money from the grid? We typically think of a building as paying money to the grid to power the building. But if we flip that around, how can a building make money from the grid? Yeah. Maybe Courtney, we go to you first and we can then just go around.
Sure. And this is where the virtual power plant solution that I mentioned and that Thomas mentioned kind of comes into play. And this is utilities starting to recognize that DERs, distributed energy resources, and buildings can really play a role in the grid. So instead of just consuming energy, they can help to store or reduce energy. And so we've seen a lot of it in the residential space with people having smart thermostats that can be adjusted remotely. And now we're seeing it in commercial and other spaces. And so what EDO is doing is we are preheating or pre-cooling buildings in order to reduce load during peak periods. And then utilities are willing to pay for those reductions in load because it reduces the stress on the overall system.
That makes sense. Thomas, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I wanted to add one thing about how these programs are changing a little bit. I think traditionally it was all based on grid emergencies. So if the grid reached a point where there was more demand than there was supply, for whatever reason, Maybe there was a fire, maybe a substation tripped off, maybe something happened where the grid actually can't provide the supply that's needed. They'd call an emergency event and resources would respond. Whatever those resources are, those could be buildings that Courtney and the team have enabled to have this load flexibility. It could be batteries that Brendan's put into the market. And they'd call all these assets to help get them out of an emergency. What's changed lately is customers can now participate for other reasons. They can participate based on price signals. Maybe there's a point where as an operator, it's actually a better use of your time and of your money to not use electricity because of what the grid will pay you based on the price per megawatt hour. Maybe you have certain sustainability goals where depending on the carbon mix of the grid, you want to curtail because that helps you reach whatever net zero standards you set for yourself. So what once was a sort of once in a blue moon emergency sort of style participation method, I think has evolved to where these customers can choose their own methods and own reasons for participating in the grid and getting compensated for it.
Yeah, it is an analogy. I know we wanted to talk about like different types ways to like talk about this to a grid owner, but what you're describing, Thomas, we'll go to you next, Brendan. But Thomas, it's like instead of like waiting for a fire and having a fire drill, it's like let's just avoid the fire entirely. And there's a lot of ways you can avoid the fire from happening. Is that maybe a fair way to think about it?
Yeah, exactly. Avoid the fire to begin with. And if you're a grid operator, you have to think about what's the alternative for me? The alternative is I need to go spend millions of dollars to spin up generation that I may or may not be able to rely on. I mean, demand response has been proven to be a more reliable generation asset than many other forms of generation. So do you want to pay people a couple $1,000s to use less energy and avoid the emergency? Or do you want to pay millions of dollars to spin up generation that is going to give you other problems? So to them, it's a reliability consideration. It's also just a price consideration of what's the best use of their own money and their own time.
Right. I mean, spinning up new generation is obviously very capital intensive as well.
Yeah.
Whereas,
right.
Yeah. But Brendan, real quick, back to my last question, just how does, from your point of view, anything to add on just how a building owner or operator can make money from the grid, this kind of paradigm shift we've talked about?
Yeah. I think what Sparkfund's model, which we can talk more about here, is more of a kind of a utility-led, sort of infrastructure sort of scaling model where the utility actually pays customers to host utility-owned assets on their property. So just a straight lease payment to provide space that may not be used or might be beneficial, sort of physically being close to a transformer, a substation, or whatever it is, and paying them to sort of just use the land. And so there's a really straightforward, revenue stream that the building owner could be eligible for if they were able to participate in something like this. And I think the idea here is that distributed energy resources, as Courtney and Thomas have said, provide immense value. And they're one of the few things that we can actually build lots of today, right? We are not subject to lengthy sort of build times when it comes to permitting or interconnection, less subject potentially to some supply chain issues we can talk more about. But, pick your sort of, favorite report. The stat that we always look at is in the DOE VPP liftoff report that came out a few years ago, right? They're talking about, I think it's 80 to 160 gigawatts of DERs could contribute, up to 20% of peak demand by 2030. And that's meaningful capacity that, we think is, that's triple basically the current scale of what's out there today. And so any and all approach, whether it's customer adopted DERs for things like resiliency or peak load management, or utility deployed DERs for general grid planning and growth, is really the only way we're going to get to numbers that are that big. And so different models out there based on sort of what the needs are, but a straight lease payment to contribute to a revenue stream is maybe another way utility or building owners could think about making money.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, no, that makes a lot of sense.
And Joe,
please. Yeah, Courtney, go. Yeah, please.
One more example. Just to continue to expand on all the innovations that are happening and how this used to be the emergency situation, and now we're evolving for lease payments and more regular calls on DERs. We participated recently in a pilot with a utility that was doing planned maintenance on a substation, and they were going to bring in a diesel genset. And instead, they just called on the assets that were on that substation. So over the course of 2 weeks, called on the assets regularly, almost every day, to reduce load in order to do that planned maintenance. So it's, removing some of the emergencies and just starting to think, how do you look differently at the land, at the building, at the assets that are based in that building to really enable them to participate in the grid?
That's a great example. No, that makes sense. I guess the big shift we're seeing beyond just, getting paid instead of paying to use energy is one paradigm shift. Demand response, you could argue, even, quote unquote, older demand response, that was kind of that paradigm shift. But now things are changing quite a bit, even beyond that, where it's not just being called on a certain day to, Thomas, the point you made, like there's a fire drill, there's an emergency. Can we get some capacity back to mitigate that emergency? And you all have kind of a different approach of how you move. You kind of move beyond, let's say, not say move away, but move beyond just the old way of doing demand response. So it'd be interesting to just hear from all of you. Maybe we start on the Voltus side, just being able to participate with ISOs, independent system operators, the market revenue you can generate, but just some examples of how things have moved beyond what was traditionally demand response to now kind of a multitude of ways to participate in the grid.
Sure. There used to be very few demand response events, maybe once every 5 years, once every 10 years. And that has changed. That's changed really dramatically this past summer. So PJM, they barely had any events in the last decade. They had 8 this summer, 8 emergency events. New York had 10 emergency events. These are serious grid-wide emergencies where these grid operators are saying, I need to lean on these VPPs as a resource I can use at any given time, not once when there's this fire drill. And so Voltus has been called for events over 15,000 times this year. We're not even out of the summer. The winter is also a pretty active season. So
winter's becoming more active.
Winter's becoming more active. Con Edison is predicting that at some point New York will be winter peaking. There are debates about whether that's going to happen in 2035 or 2050, or everyone has their hot take. But we're going to surpass more events this year than we've had in the last 8 years at Voltus. These events are happening more and more frequently. And what we've tried to do at Voltus is build a technology that allows us to dispatch these assets very frequently and to do it in an automated fashion. So traditionally, you might have to manually call, go to a site, someone pulls a switch, they then shift their load consumption, and then they get compensated for that. And what we've tried to do is integrate with partners like Edo, like others, from big building management systems to newer energy management systems, and then be able to automatically dispatch resources for short notice events, long duration events, any sort of combination of event that the building might want to participate in.
No, it makes a lot of sense. Courtney, do you have anything to add? I know in terms of, we talked, the old traditional way of doing demand response, and now you mentioned pre-cooling buildings, preheating buildings. There's also a retrocommissioning component here that can help.
So Edo's whole reason for existence is being able to work with buildings in a way that has really low impact on occupants and is really light touch for facility managers. So technology has evolved. We send out kind of this plug and play gateway, which anybody's watching the video, I'm holding it up. It's just a small little computer that allows us to pull data from everything in the building that's streaming data. And getting access to data in commercial buildings has traditionally been really challenging because how data points are named is different for every controls contract or every piece of equipment. And so we've been able to unlock that data, and that allows us to, in a way that does not require us to call in the controls contract or rewrite any control sequences, we can then just shift set points in advance of an event. So we'll work with facility managers to establish what the set points are that are still comfortable for tenants, and then expand them a couple degrees. and then just do that pre-cooling. And tenants, for the most part, never even know an event is happening. And facility managers have the ability to cancel an event, receive notifications, but don't have to do anything. And so that's a big shift than having to turn off part of your building, which historically was what was required. So, and it allows us to do, like with that substation upgrade with one major fitness center, we shifted load 8 times in 13 days and nobody noticed. And so we're able to do it on a more regular basis. Well, typically, historically, buildings will participate a couple of times. Like, this is too much work, too much impact on our occupants. We don't want to do this. And now just happens.
Yeah. Well, you're definitely speaking my language when you talk about control sequences, obviously, anyone who listens to the podcast. But I think that's a bigger problem in our industry, where a lot of times unlocking data, doing some analysis of the data, that can lead to more work to the operator of the building. You kind of touched on that at the end, right? Where we'll give you some information that will help make your building more efficient. It's like, yes, but I'm already doing 10 hours of work in an 8-hour day. I don't have time to do more. You know, there's more than that, but I think I just wanted to elaborate or emphasize that point, because I think that has been a bit of a challenge for our industry in general, right? Like, better data doesn't necessarily lead to a better outcome.
And we try to really support facility managers. So we do the identification of kind of anomalies in the system when, for instance, a chiller is running, off the schedule that it should be running, that's most efficient for the building. And so we are feeding them actions that they can take that are pretty low lift to help with what we have identified through the data. And we also have building engineers that are really there to support facility managers, because we know how busy they are with other things.
Yeah. Brendan, just kind of to wrap up this topic a little bit, when we were prepping, you were talking about kind of a telecom tower analogy of just, and I know, like, condos I've lived in the past, like, they're leasing some space on their roof for, a cell phone company, and that's kind of a win around the horn. But I guess that's a topic that you brought up as a good way to think about how we're changing from, we'll just pay you on a couple days to reduce load, to now there's a lot of different ways that you can get paid by the grid, to simplify.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we joke a little bit around Sparkfund is that this model is both sort of new from the standpoint of utilities thinking about scaling DERs, but also not really new at all. It's kind of just a utility being a utility and using sort of like proven infrastructure models like a leasing model to pay folks for space, and just doing that kind of on a different part of the grid, maybe more than they used to. I think what I would point to, Joe, in terms of maybe what's the thing that kind of comes to my mind to your question around kind of what's innovative, is this notion of really incorporating DERs into centralized planning and control processes that utilities have as they're doing things like integrated resource plans or distribution system planning, and saying, DERs historically sort of been this thing that utilities have had to react to based on sort of where customers are randomly adopting them on the system. And what we're asking is, well, what if we kind of turn that around and said, what if utilities got proactive with DERs and thought about them at a large enough scale to really make a meaningful impact on their system, be able to potentially avoid or defer meaningful investments in the system, and then add, capacity quickly, which is, something obviously that's being driven by a huge, influx in demand centers and manufacturing and electric vehicles. And so thinking about these, almost in the same way that you would think about utility scale gas or renewables or transmission or all kind of your traditional bulk power resources, and building them into the planning processes that have existed for decades is something we think that is, newer than the kind of ways that they used to do in the past.
Yeah, great.
Cool. Okay. Switching things up a little bit, Courtney, given what you do and Edo's focus, and just in general from what we've seen across the space over the last 6 to 12 months, perhaps even a little bit longer, we're seeing more conversations around virtual power plants. From your standpoint, what actually makes a virtual power plant?
Yeah, virtual power plant is an aggregation of different resources. So people often think of solar and storage, but it's also thermal storage, it's EVs, it's buildings, it's homes that can shift load when needed. And so, as we've discussed, it used to be during emergency periods, and now we're recognizing that it can be much more often. So when aggregated, all those resources show up on the grid the same as a power plant, even though in reality they're actually reducing load.
Yeah, I would just add that it's a significant amount of load flexibility. I mean, Voltus has the equivalent of many nuclear power plants of load to contribute to the grid in these different markets. This is a massive resource, and our goal is to have it be really interconnected with the utilities, the grid operators, the customers, our technology partners in a way where how and why you get dispatched and then how you get compensated for that is really transparent. I think one of the challenges in this industry is literacy on how and why your electricity bill looks the way it does is pretty poor. It almost reminds me of that congressional session on how the internet works. No one quite knows, if any of you watch that. No one really gets how electricity works, and so we try to make it as transparent as possible of this event happened for 13 minutes in this part of PJM, and here's why. Here's the resources we used, and here's how you're going to get compensated for that.
And compensating for the full value stack too. These assets are really valuable to the grid. And right now utilities are, I think, still kind of stuck in the old way of thinking of they're going to pay for maybe one event a year. And now you have these really flexible assets that can reduce load quite quickly, and just play a really valuable load. And even more so if they're properly compensated, because then they're more willing to flex on a regular basis.
Yeah, and Brendan, on this in general, we've seen that it works and that there's incredible potential. Where do you think the scale happens? How do we unlock scale? Because it seems like we've got the technology. So what are the other pieces missing for this to become more adopted?
Yeah. It's a great question. And, having sort of come up in this space, all the work that our collective companies and really our industry have done over the last 10, 15 years have shown that it can work, right? And that's through how, assets are performing inside of a particular homeowner or business, out to how they're being then aggregated together and responding to meaningful events with meaningful capacity. I think part of my answer is going back to thinking about centralized planning and saying, okay, if you look at a given IRP, say for a utility, maybe looking for, we were talking to a utility a couple of weeks ago, who's got a gigawatt of storage in their IRP. They need a gigawatt of new storage on their system by 2030. And most of what is going to make up that storage are a bunch of large, 100 megawatt, 150 megawatt battery projects. But there is potentially an opportunity, if that utility values time to power or speed to power, whatever term you want to use, to effectively slice off, say, 100 or 150 megawatts of that and do it distributed and do it now, right? Or effectively now, right? Over the next couple of years versus, say, over the next 5 or 6. And so to answer your question, scale can really sort of happen here when we are able to leverage the infrastructure we've built out over the last 100 years, which is our grid, and build in sort of resources that can be put in the places that makes the most sense and used as part of a broader sort of infrastructure or even societal level planning process to get there. And part of what Sparkfund does then is support utilities who are thinking about doing that, because utilities, for the most part, are very good at doing large bulk power projects, right? They're good at building big utility scale. They're good at building, new transformers, substations, whatever it is. They have less experience doing a bunch of small projects. And so that's where we come in to help them with engaging customers to explain how the program works. We then engage a sort of a local competitive value chain of companies who know their businesses and know their territories well to bid on these projects, just in the same way that a utility may put out an all-source RFP for large-scale projects, right? And invite the local community and contractors and vendors to bid on and eventually put steel on the ground, build these projects. And so I think when you latch on to, you have to pair it with customer adopted resources, of course, because that's always going to be the cheapest resource. But if you can then also take advantage of how a utility could scale up these resources when put into central planning, given the load growth sort of needs that we have as a society, you can really kind of get to that next level of scale.
Okay, interesting. And Courtney, when you think about virtual power plants, do you see the market adopting them and replacing peakers over the next 5 to 10 years?
I mean, I think so. Brendan brought up some of the really good stats, or DOE has, and Brattle Group has done the calculations that it can be about 20% of the peak load by 2030. I mean, I think California has about 800 megawatts, which is the equivalent of 8 natural gas peaker plants already in their virtual power plants. So absolutely, I think, as technologies continue to improve, as the cost of storage decreases, as payment for this flexibility increases, then I think that we'll see a major shift away from gas peaker plants.
What about when it comes to the convergence of models? When you think about what each of your businesses do, do the models converge into one ecosystem? It feels like that there's a way, or perhaps even happening right now.
Yeah, I think so. I think we all play really different roles, which is great to be on the call with people who are so complementary. We're not competitors. We're all playing different roles in this really important aim to have more flexibility on the grid so that we keep cost low for ratepayers, so that we can decarbonize the grid, and so that we can ensure that the grid stays reliable. And so those are really important pieces. I think we're all aiming to achieve those 3 goals and going about it in different ways. Ito's really focused on this automated shifting of load in commercial buildings, both from the buildings, and we can work with DERs within the buildings. Well, Thomas and Brendan, I'll let you jump in here, where you fit in that value stack.
Well, I think what I would add to this is there is a role that we can collectively play as an industry to sort of standardize what sort of performance needs to look like in the market to respond to a certain event, or for a utility to kind of have the confidence that a resource is going to show up. And Thomas can speak better than I can to sort of the intricacies of what that needs to look like on the customer side. I think one of the things that we are trying to help utilities get their arms wrapped around is, what are the sort of the specs and the QA processes and the sort of requirements that they are going to need to have to be confident that this is going to show up. This is one of the issues I think that the DR industry writ large has struggled with over the years is, I have all this capacity, it's ready to go, and the utility says, I don't trust that it's going to show up. And so we may all have different business models, but I think in a kind of a bigger tent perspective, we can all say, okay, this is what a DR needs to do, whether it's a generation resource, whether it's a storage resource, whatever, to show up. And then we can all collectively sort of send what we've got up the chain and try to get to some of those like 20% of peak demand, bigger figures that we were talking about before.
I agree with all that, Lewis. I would add one point on the peaker plant question. I would say we can get there only if we have a policy environment that allows us to get there. One of the big problems in the United States is there's a huge portion of the country that is excluded from this VPP ecosystem. That can take a lot of different forms. There's places like Michigan where they set really, really difficult requirements for what you need to have and who you need to be in order to participate in demand response programs. So in Michigan, as a customer, you have to have more than 1 megawatt of load flexibility in a given utility territory. So if I'm a building in Detroit, I need more than 1 megawatt of load flexibility in DTE territory. There's not a ton of companies that meet that hurdle. That excludes most commercial real estate. That excludes a lot of smaller batteries. That excludes the residential community. That excludes gigawatts of load flexibility because of that requirement. Michigan needs to change that requirement. There's also policy rules, like certain states have opted out of allowing their residents to participate in these demand response programs. So a place like Iowa, even though it's in MISO, it's in that Midwest system operator grid, Iowa's opted out of the market. So Iowa's customers can't participate in any of these programs that we've talked about today. And so I think, yes, can we get gigawatts and gigawatts of VPPs and DERs connected to the grid, and can we get the technology and the financial models and everything that can get us to this future we all want to get to? Absolutely. But we're not going to retire the 1,000 peaker plants that are left if more than a third of the country is excluded from the market. So that's a complicated problem. I don't know that the five of us are going to solve that in the next 20 minutes, but policy is going to be a real limiting factor unless I think we can educate the local, state, federal level to make some of these changes that we need to.
I'd love to switch gears a little bit and talk about like how you take this to a customer, a building, but maybe Thomas, to your point, that in like preparing to start talking about how do you bring this and sell it and show the value before deploying, the thought I had for what you said was this must be extremely difficult for a portfolio that has properties across a lot of territories. And if we know anything, there's over 3,000 utilities. Yeah, a lot of big cities have a utility, but there's plenty of big cities where as you get out to the exurbs, it's a different utility. And that must be a challenge where you, the building owner operator, are interested in these programs, but the array of policies across your buildings across multiple territories make it very hard. So maybe I'll go to you real quick and just see if you have anything to add on that point, and then we can kind of go around the horn.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just working on a proposal for a real estate investment and management company that has a lot of properties across the Midwest and the Mid-Atlantic. They have about 5 megawatts of load flexibility that we can tap into because they have technology like UDO's technology. They have batteries and generators. They have all these assets. Only about a megawatt can participate in the market. So they're happy that a megawatt can participate, and they're going to actually earn and save about $100,000 a year. That's great. But 4 megawatts is excluded. And that's because in this market, diesel generators are allowed to do this, not that. And in another market, natural gas generators are allowed to do this, but not that. And in this market, there's a 1 megawatt minimum. And in that market, there's not. And so if you're a portfolio, and we work with a lot of these portfolio companies, like the Walmarts and Home Depots and sort of companies of the world that have sites all over, it becomes really complex to manage.
The number you described, like 5 megawatts potentially that's flexible, but they can only actually use 1 megawatt. So 20% is, just given your expertise, given what you've seen, is it pretty common that a lot of the load that is flexible isn't actually able to be utilized, or is it rare to see that small percentage of the given flexibility?
No, it's often stranded.
Stranded. Yeah.
Yeah. We had a chain. I won't name them, but one of my favorite fast food chains that wanted to enroll all of their locations in the Midwest into these types of programs. But each of those stores only has about 5 to 10 kilowatts of flexibility because they're not going to turn off the freezers completely. They're not going to shut down the lights. They're still serving customers. They still need to maintain operations and safety and all that. And they don't meet the minimums. So they wanted to sign up. They actually signed a contract to sign up. And then the rules of the state and of these markets said no, and we had to unenroll them from the market. And there's megawatts that are stranded there. So that's a common story, unfortunately. And so I think part of it's a technology solution, but a lot of it's a policy solution to help us bring those stranded megawatts back into the market.
If we talk more broadly, when you're going, and maybe Courtney will go to you, and then Brendan, we can go to you, and then Thomas, if you want to add anything, that's great too. Going to an owner of a building, multiple buildings, what seems to resonate the most? Or is it multiple things from, we can deliver revenue to you, or you can just see a reduction in your average utility bill, or this gives you more resilience, or this is a sustainability play. There's an advantage there. Maybe it's a lot of things. Maybe it varies, but I'd be interested, Courtney, in hearing from you. Like, what do you feel like resonates the most with owners in terms of the benefits they're receiving, the value they're receiving?
For us, it a lot of it is focused on kind of the retro commissioning piece of our solution. Right now, because of this legacy way that demand response was structured, often the payments aren't high enough for a really busy facility manager to engage in a standalone DR program. And so what we're offering them is this whole tune-up of their building where they're lowering their energy cost by 10 to 15% with pretty minimal upfront capital. And then we're focusing on those operational improvements of the building and extending the lifetime of their equipment. And so that provides a lot of value for these facility managers. And then because the demand flexibility side of it is really light touch, we've built that trust with them. They can see what's happening in their building by either talking to our 24/7 call center team or just going on our platform. They have a deeper understanding of what we're going to be doing and then trust us to do it. So the demand flexibility is actually almost the kind of cherry on top. Right now, it's the upfront energy efficiency work, demand charge management, operational improvements, and just deeper insight into their buildings that they value the most.
And one of the things, underlying what you were saying, I would imagine, you can tell me if I'm wrong, I would imagine some of these buildings they're old. They haven't really maintained the building as much as they should have. So they see this as almost an anchor event or an opportunity to bring the building kind of back up to a more, efficient operational state. But this gives them a reason to do that. And you see that with a lot of other things in our industry where maybe the core value that's being delivered, that is helpful, but really I haven't commissioned my building in 10 or recommissioned my building in 10 years. I have an opportunity to do that, and I get these other benefits too. Is that kind of a fair take on what you were noting, Courtney?
It is, and most of the time our solution is paid for by the utilities. So utilities are mandated to offer energy efficiency programs and to recruit buildings or other assets into their demand response programs. And so the buildings are getting this for free for the most part. Yeah. They're getting the free energy audit, they're getting the software, they're getting the support from our building engineers. So it's just kind of a pretty easy way for them to do this tune-up for their building that most of them pretty need. We work a lot with schools, and schools, for instance, you have one facility manager managing 30 buildings, trying to keep the water fountains running, the elevators working and everything else. And so giving them this free light touch way to just improve the operations of their building is really valuable.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Brendan, anything you want to add on what resonates in terms of the value prop, the benefits that the building owner, building operator receive?
Yeah, I mean, sort of where my mind goes on this is like just the simplification of any of these offers is so critical. We often forget, those of us who kind of live in this world every day, that businesses have to do where are they gonna run the business every day, or this customer has a home to run, they got to take their kids to school, they got to go to work. Thinking about energy as much as we do is pretty uncommon in the broader population. And so to really simplify is key. And I think when you think about things like conversion rates and adoption rates, we have a bunch of experience running utility energy programs, and there's some interesting math around how much, and this is particularly true on the C&I side, how much the subsidization of a particular project has an impact on conversion rate. And roughly speaking, we've seen instances where if there's, say, a 25% rebate on a project that a customer may be eligible for, and you compare that to the conversion rate of a differing program that has maybe an 80% rebate or something larger, closer to almost of the whole project, that the conversion rates are roughly the same. If a customer still needs to go and get a contract done, they still need to get approval, even if it's for a smaller amount of money than the entire cost of the project, you still run into some friction and you struggle, I think, to get to the kinds of numbers we're all hungry to get to. And so I'll give you one quick example. We manage a program with a utility where a utility will pay for in full backup generators for resiliency or solar and storage projects, either for resiliency or for peak load management. And that program has a 94% enrollment rate over a 3.5 year period. And we've done, a few thousand total sort of installed projects, both across residential and commercial customers. And so not saying that everything needs to be free necessarily, but when you can make things as simple and easy for customers to sort of enroll or to adopt, I think the more success you'll see. And I realize that's an earth-shattering statement, but it really is true in our industry. the complexity of a lot of these offers historically, I think, has turned folks off to even sort of consider participating in the first place.
That makes sense.
So if we look at just the landscape of the industry and just what's going on in the world, let's focus specifically on the US. Are you, and would love to get everyone's thoughts here, but are you seeing tariffs and capital flows change where projects are getting built and just the landscape in general?
Well, I think we see it in an indirect way. So some of the challenges with getting new power plants built. So it takes, at this point in time, about 5+ years to get a new power plant built. And we're seeing this really extreme projective increase in overall load growth and peak load growth on the grid. And that's driven mainly by artificial intelligence and data centers, but also by electrification, increased manufacturing. And so where we're seeing that impact is utilities now are like, how are we going to meet this load growth? And there are supply chain challenges. There's uncertainty around tariffs. There's just a lot of uncertainty that is preventing utilities from doing what they traditionally do, which is just build a new power plant. And so this is where what we're all doing is becoming more valuable because we can meet some of these peak needs in a lower cost and shorter time frame, really importantly, way.
Nice. Brendan, anything else to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think, general uncertainty is never a good thing, when it comes to policy and how that impacts things like supply chain or procurement. I think, the way that we sort of think about this is these policies are having an impact of, in certain cases at least, eliminating some of the resources that we have at our disposal to help with getting more generation onto the system. But that the beauty of batteries in particular, right, is these entities can absorb power when it's, in the middle of the night or wherever, when it's really cheap, and we have more existing capacity, and then inject that into the system during periods of peak demand. And the general sort of idea of flexibility, which is, all in the news, these days, particularly as it pertains to data centers, but other large loads as well, right, is that the ability to increase the overall system utilization of our grid, right, is one of the few sort of tools or levers that we have right now to put a downward pressure on rates. Right, to grow the grid inherently, as the way we designed this thing 100 years ago, is to say we're all going to collectively pay for this because that's what we've decided to do, right? And that's, in a lot of ways, a fair way to do it. But we have all this capacity that's sort of sitting around for 50%, 70% of the time, right? And so the more that we can tap into that, I think the better off that we'll be. And so when you say, okay, well, then how do tariffs, supply chain, other things impact batteries in particular? We've been encouraged through some of the OEMs that we're talking to doing larger scale procurements to support our distributed capacity procurements that are really sort of turning their operations around to be more domestically focused. A lot of folks still relying on China, especially for, sort of at the cell level. But I think making some positive, changes to how they're thinking about their supply chain internally that can help with some of the uncertainty that sort of exists there. So I think more sort of uncertainty than certainty right now, which again is never a good thing, but maybe some positive kind of glimmers there for the domestic supply chain to enable us to do these things that I'm talking about.
Great. And just going back to something that you said earlier, Thomas, you were talking about the increase in emergency events, and I've just been thinking with so many of these events coming up and potentially that increasing, how does that then change the urgency?
I think it increases the urgency dramatically. and I think, unfortunately, what's happening is you're having certain states recognize that and certain states enable that with the resources that they're putting behind DERs. That could be utility incentive programs, like Courtney and Brendan have talked about. That could be the wholesale market pricing or structures that are allowed. And so in a place like Massachusetts, if you have a battery, you can get $400,000 per megawatt out of that battery. That's a great return. You can have a 3-year return on a battery in Massachusetts. Massachusetts is already far along on their sustainability journey and transition. Not to say they've reached the end zone, but they're farther along than many other states. And so we're seeing a lot of investment go to places like Massachusetts, places like West Virginia. They still have energy emergencies just like anywhere else in the United States. They've set a cap on the number of megawatts you can have for behind the meter solar. They've set a cap on the sort of bill savings programs that customers can benefit from. There's all these limitations. And so my concern is emergencies are nationwide. They do not discriminate based on state or customer type or anything like that. But policy and market dynamics and these other factors are encouraging investment and the development of this sort of VPP ecosystem in some states far more than others.
Okay, great. And just a final question before we move on, with a lot of our listeners being building automation focused in some point in their career, obviously the integration piece is tough, but how are you seeing the integration of gateways and BAS in general? Courtney, maybe you start?
Yeah, the way our system is pretty unique in that we don't work directly with the BAS. We connect via BACnet to the heating, ventilation, air conditioning equipment, the HVAC equipment. So we do get around some of the challenges with controls contractors, but we do see just really old systems that can't handle any type of changes. And so that's one thing we see sometimes in schools, that the systems just, even though the way that we shift load is so light touch, we're just changing a set point for in advance of the event, and then after the event we remove that from the array sequence. It's just some of these systems are too old to even be able to handle that. So that is one of the challenges that we see. That, and then also just working, sometimes it can be quite a long process to work with an IT department to get them to think innovatively about what a building can do, which we do understand. And we're willing to really partner with them to answer their questions. But just making sure that they feel comfortable. This is a different way for buildings to work. Same utilities need to think differently. Some of the buildings and the IT staff and cybersecurity, very valid that they have concerns around kind of shifting the operations of a building. But that can just result in some delays or some, quite significant portfolios of buildings and DERs that aren't able to participate because of hesitation from the IT department.
That makes a lot of sense. Maybe around to all three of you, I'd just be interested in biggest misconception you find out in the market, talking to customers, talking to partners. Maybe we'll go Brendan and then finish with Courtney. Thomas, you can go in the middle.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was talking before about sort of the performance of DERs, sort of from a physical performance standpoint. And I think I'd say, if this was a few years ago, you may still find some apprehension from various stakeholders, say inside of utility planning or procurement. That has changed in a big way, and I think now where, and I don't know if this is necessarily a challenge per se, but it is how then can DERs at scale actually contribute to larger grid operations? Like, what does that actually look like? Because we haven't done that before as a society, and so it's more of a kind of a learning maybe than it is a misconception. But if you have 100 megawatts worth of distributed storage on your distribution system, what can you really do with that, right? These are not one-off, non-wires alternative sort of pilots. Hey, what does the cost of this battery versus the cost of upgrading this substation look like? Which oftentimes get just sort of cost benefit analysis to death, if that's to use a technical term, right? What if you had a lot more? Like, what could that do? What are the sort of values that could flow upstream to the transmission system, right? There's all kinds of new ways to think about using DERs at scale that are, I think, just now starting to get to the forefront of your system planners and your grid operators, which we're excited to be a part of. So that kind of conversation is one that we're in every single day with utilities that we're talking to, and I think much more to learn about how that can really sort of impact not just that particular system, but customers, ratepayers in general.
Yeah, great. Thomas, over to you. Biggest misconception you find in the industry?
Yeah, I think it's that building owners and operators think that demand response is all or nothing, that I have to shut down my facility, or I have to make some dramatic change in how I operate my building. And maybe that was true years ago when we had these more traditional capacity programs. That's not true anymore. And so what we spend a lot of time educating these building owners on and operators on is how they can participate in other programs, ancillary programs, energy programs. The average duration of an ancillary market program in PJM is 11 minutes. What load flexibility can you find for 11 minutes? If you turned the thermostats from 68 to 73 for 11 minutes, would anyone notice? Would that really change tenant comfort? Do we really need to do a full shutdown, or can we find 10% reduction in fan speed? Can we find modest changes in static pressure? Can we make these minor adjustments? I think oftentimes these building owners and operators are really hesitant to participate because they think, I can't shut down my elevator bank. Well, I don't need you to shut down your elevator bank. I need you to find 5, 10, 50, 100 kilowatts. Can we find that? And I think we can in most commercial properties. New York has hundreds of megawatts of demand response potential in its commercial buildings, and it's something like 730 million square feet. It's just an absurd figure of office space in New York. We don't need all those buildings to shut down. We just need them to make these modest changes that allow them to still operate the buildings the way.
Yeah. It's funny too, the point we had earlier about old traditional way of doing demand response. I mean, there are all these stories of, you're a large industrial facility, a factory, getting a phone call. Can you delay the next run on your assembly line for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour? And we'll give you a very large check if you can do that. So to your point of the kind of misconception, it used to be a little bit more black or white, on or off. Obviously now, as we've discussed, it's not. So that makes sense. Courtney, to you, biggest misconception that you find customers, prospects, others have.
Yeah, I wouldn't say this is a misconception. I'd say this is a valid conception that we're trying to change, and it's that utilities are just a pain. That they have complicated bills when you're trying to figure out your demand charge management, the tariff increases, that you've got to talk to one team to get rebates for batteries. There's these multiple DR programs. What's happening in the energy efficiency world? I think for a lot of facility managers, there's just so much work to work with utilities that they haven't wanted to. And so that's a big part of what I think all of us here are trying to change, is how do we improve the customer experience so that utilities and buildings have a better relationship, and it's easier for buildings to tap into all of these different rebates, all of these different payments for flexibility or energy efficiency. So kind of a whole building optimization that includes storage, and just makes the customer journey easier when working with the utility.
That's great. I would say another kind of quick one, as we're getting close to the end here, and we can go in the same order, maybe for you, to you first, Brendan. What excites you most about the future as it relates to this industry, where we're taking buildings, how buildings can interact more with the grid?
Yeah, I mean, just to toot our own horn directly here. I mean, we're excited about our DCP model. We're excited to see what kind of scale we can sort of achieve with again incorporating things like batteries and storage and generators into central utility planning processes, and creating massive new solicitations for the local market to bid into, to go build 5 megawatts, 10 megawatts, 20 megawatts every month, every quarter, whatever the cadence and the size of the program looks like. And so we very much have this, I mentioned sort of Big Tent energy at Sparkfund. We need all of these things to get to the sort of those 20% of peak demand numbers that we were talking about before. And so we're excited about leveraging sort of the scale of what utilities can be. But I think I would also say, like, bringing together our industry. There's been a lot of infighting, just to to put that lightly, in our industry over the last decade or so. And given again that we are one of the few industries that can build a lot of this stuff now, or aggregate a lot of this stuff right now, it is available. It can contribute to the grid today. We should be coming together in a way that finds a lot of sort of at least the least common denominators of where we can all sort of advocate together to push this industry forward. And we're starting to sense a lot of that in the work that we do, not just talking to utilities, but talking to developers, contractors, OEMs, folks who want to have kind of a place in a really interesting moment in market history, right? I mean, this, the fast growing grid and something that hasn't happened in the last 20 years, well, it is now. And so how can we come together as an industry to really sort of move forward? I think that's something that's really exciting to consider.
Yeah. What about you, Thomas? What excites you for the future as it relates to our industry?
So many things. I want someone to invent a battery that can go inside. I think that would change the game for all of us. Maybe we'll get there one day. I think what's exciting right now is we actually have people's attention. I don't think we had people's attention for a long time. I felt like the one kid that went into climate tech. Everyone else took a different path. It's electricity prices, AI load growth. All of these topics are on the nightly news. It's on the front page of the paper. These are things that people are aware of, that they're consuming, that they're concerned about. If you're a business in New Jersey, your electricity prices just went up 25%. That has to have your attention. And so I think we have a really rare opportunity as a collective group here to capitalize on that intention and say, with all the different solutions that we bring to the table, we can address those electricity costs. We can address your reliability concerns. We can address what's keeping you up at night, and hopefully help make the grid a little bit more reliable and affordable in the process.
That's great. Courtney, what about you? What excites you for the future?
Yeah, I think I'm excited to see that utilities are starting to innovate, and they're starting to recognize the need to scale really quickly. Historically, they have created pilots, and you kind of get stuck in this pilot death spiral and you never get out of it. And now we're seeing utilities with these demand flexibility virtual power plant programs just skip the pilots and go directly to programs, or like the Connecticut regulator has created this innovation program where it's 18 months of a pilot, and if you're successful with a pilot, it goes to a program. And so you're just starting to see this innovation. You're starting to see utilities start to think differently. California is starting to think about, how do we pay for some of the recruitment of buildings into virtual power plants, as opposed to only paying for the load shifting. It does take time and cost money to talk to these building owners and bring them into buildings. So just both regulators and utilities are starting to realize this is a really valuable way to help both the assets, the building owners, the facility managers, and the grid. And what can they do to creatively bring the two sides of the meter together?
Yeah, that's great. Maybe in closing, we're kind of doing a modified rapid fire. We like to end the podcast with a couple just quick questions. One word that you would just use to describe our industry, if you can come up with one. And maybe we could start with you, Brendan, and go the same order, or if somebody wants to jump in first.
Congealing.
That's good. Yeah. Thomas, do you have one?
Misunderstood.
That's fair.
Courtney, do you want?
I'm gonna go with optimization. Let's use what we got and make it all work better.
Well, this is fascinating for me. I mean, working in buildings, inside the building, behind the meter, if you will, dealing with and working with companies working on controls, we're always aware there's a big world out there of the whole grid. It interacts, the building with the grid. But to dig in more with all three of you has been really wonderful. So I appreciate, or Lewis and I both appreciate you being here and talking to us about what your companies do, what you're doing, and what you're passionate about.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys.